Welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. Now, despite being one of the founding members of the United Nations and portraying itself as a just society, Canada has just lost its bid for a seat on the UN Security Council. Canada's self-image is one of a liberal, peace-loving democracy, but it didn't stop organizations from around the world to organize petition drives demanding that UN member states not allow Canada to have a seat. The campaign succeeded, and Ireland won that seat instead. The Canadian ambassador to the UN, Marc-André Blanchard, tried to explain Canada's failure. Let's have a listen.
At the UN, the race for the Security Council in the Western European and others group that we belong to, the regional group that we belong to, is always very, very competitive. The races are tight, and this year was no difference. And then when you have a race like the one we were in, with three great countries that have a lot to bring to the world and to the UN, it's a difficult choice for the countries and the member states. And each country has 193 different reasons why they would support one country or another. And this is this is the politics of the UN that is very tricky and very difficult and complex. And we will have plenty of time to actually look at that in the near future.
So led by many people, including people like Bianca Mogherini at the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, over 100 organizations, including Canadians for a Just Peace in the Middle East, argue that Canada doesn't deserve a seat on the Security Council because foreign policy just mimics U.S. foreign policy as its own, especially in the Middle East. And it doesn't pay its fair share of international aid and sells arms to notorious human rights violators around the world. Canada's record on Israel-Palestine is especially bad. In 2018, the foreign minister in Canada, whose name was Christina Freeland, told Israelis that if Canadians had a seat on the council, it would be, quote, an asset to Israel. Ireland and Norway won more votes than Canada for this seat, in part because of the work they do. And they recognize the status of Palestine as a nation and have a much better record than Canada does on promoting peace throughout the world. In April, we spoke with Eve Engler right here at The Real News about Canada's decision to sell armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia despite the arms embargo. And since then, Canada has also sold optical systems to Turkey. They may be fighting each other with those weapons. So now it's time to go back to Eve Engler to get a deeper look at what is happening and why and what the future might hold. Welcome back, Eve. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And to remind you all, Eve Engler is a Canadian commentator and author. His most recent book is The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy. He previously has published the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy and Canada and Haiti, Waging War on the Poor Majority. And Eve, so let's begin with what just happened before we kind of dive into what could happen and what is happening. So the UN Security Council, with its 5 permanent members, all of whom are heavily armed nations and deeply involved in different parts of the world and human rights violators in some part, just said they would not allow Canada on. And so it's interesting to me that Norway and Ireland, both smaller countries, are standing up for human rights, got these seats. I mean, so is something switching at the UN? Is this how do you analyze what just happened?
Well, it's a matter of the General Assembly. That's who voted, the 193 members of the General Assembly. And the members of the General Assembly, I think, voted against Canada in large part because the Canadian government's identified as being very close to the Trump administration, close to Netanyahu in Israel, is aligned with indifference to, climate catastrophe in Africa. Canada's has a huge mining sector involved in all kinds of conflicts around the world. So I think that the vote at the General Assembly, I don't want to argue that this is just morality entering into play, but I think morality did enter into play. I mean, I think there's a lot of countries in the world, like a country like Uganda. Maybe you could say that Uganda has a repressive domestic policies. But there is a sense of internationalism. There's a sense of anti-imperialism, and the UN ambassador of Uganda or maybe Nicaragua or another country, basically when it came down to the private vote, they assessed Canadian foreign policy and Canadian foreign policy is a much more militaristic, much more pro-corporate, anti-Palestinian foreign policy than is the Irish foreign policy or the Norwegian foreign policy, and that's in large part why Canada lost quite badly in its bid to sit on the Security Council.
So let's kind of explore this a bit deeper. That when you look at the Trudeau government coming in as the Liberal Party, people thought that that government would come in and turn over some of Harper's policies. But what's happened is this, it seems to me that Trudeau's government is not changed the things Harper's done internationally, maybe and even done more. And B, that it just kind of shows kind of a, for want of a better term, a neoliberal inability to control capitalism or control the mining interests and its own arm industry. So what's the political dynamic inside Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what we need to look at, which is that there's more structural explanations for Canada's foreign policy than there is if it's Stephen Harper or if it's Justin Trudeau, or even if it happened to be Jagmeet Singh, who's the leader of the supposedly social democratic NDP. That there are structural factors within Canadian society that drive a foreign policy in a certain direction. And so there is a lot more that's similar between Stephen Harper's foreign policy and Justin Trudeau's foreign policy than is different. I alluded to some before, but just to take a look at Canada's voting record at the UN on resolutions dealing with Palestinian rights. In fact, Justin Trudeau's voting record in his first 4 years was more anti-Palestinian than Stephen Harper's voting record at the UN on Palestinian rights. If you look at Canada's involvement in NATO, the Trudeau government has sent Canadian troops to Latvia on the border with Russia. Canadian troops as part of NATO with Americans in Iraq. Canadian naval vessels are part of these NATO patrols in the Middle East, in the Baltic. So they've continued with this, ramped up number of Canadian special forces. So you see that even though Justin Trudeau tends to speak a bit more of a liberal kind of rhetoric on militarism or peace, in fact, his policy largely has continued with the predecessor. And there's probably no area that's more clear on that than the question of the mining sector. Canada has about half of the world's mining companies are based or listed in Canada. Canada has 0.5% of the world's population. So 100 times Canada's proportion of the world's population, its dominance in the mining sector. And the Trudeau government promised to bring in reforms that would end public support for mining companies found to be engaged in major abuses abroad. They announced it, they promised it before coming to office. They repeated that promise after coming to office. They began a whole commission, and after a pushback from the mining sector in this country, basically they came up with an ombudsperson that has almost no power to even compel companies to provide documentation about some of the things they may have been involved with, and basically no power to end public support for those mining companies. So that the mining sector, of course, is a very powerful force within Canada, and over the past 25 years, as there's been neoliberal reforms in Africa and Latin America, Canadian mining companies have just absolutely skyrocketed. So in Mexico, 25 years ago, there were no Canadian mining companies. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of Canadian mining companies. There's something like 75% of all the mining companies in Mexico, and that's totally tied to neoliberal reforms in Mexico. And so Canadian capital, Canadian business class is very committed to maintaining those policies in Mexico and many other countries. So Justin Trudeau's government has mostly just continued that because there are some structural forces that want more of that type of policy.
So it's interesting. So one of the things I think is important maybe to bring out here is that it might be overly simplistic to say that Canada merely mimics U.S. foreign policy, but that it goes hand in hand because the foreign policy interests of Canada are motivated by things that are similar to what motivates the United States in terms of its own capital interests. I mean, whether it's arms dealing or the mining sector, the minute amount of money that Canada spends on international aid as compared to other countries. I mean, so you can't put this all of just mimicking U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I've said, over and over again, there's basically two forces that drive Canadian foreign policy: support for empire and support for corporate interest. Historically, support for the British Empire. Today, support for the American Empire and Canadian corporate interest. And the Canadian mining companies and Canadian aid policy and diplomacy and even military policy, which support the mining sector in Jamaica, in Mexico, in Congo, in Senegal. No one in Washington is forcing those Canadian companies and Canadian diplomats to act in a way to serve, to back up mining companies that are, pollute local waterways, kill opponents in local communities to their mines. No one in the U.S. is forcing, Canadian companies or Canadian diplomats to go in that direction. So Canada has a very expansive international investment class or capitalist class that is totally tied into, pillaging the resources of the Congo or of countries in Central America. I would say that the way to formulate it is that the Canadian elite see the world and profit from the world in a very similar way to the U.S. elite. Yes, there are times when the Trump administration or the Obama administration before that puts pressure on Canada to go in a certain direction. I think you see that especially in military policy. The U.S. is constantly pushing Canada to increase its military spending, pushing Canada to engage in different, foreign wars or foreign missions. But there are elements to, Canadian structural elements to Canadian economic and political life that pushed Canada towards a belligerent policy abroad that had nothing to do with pressure from Washington.
Well, and let's kind of conclude this around the issue of pressure. The pressure put on the United Nations member states. How much effect do you think that had in denying them the seat? And what does that mean for a building movement, both in Canada and around the globe? And in terms of what really motivated them being denied the seat, but also just how it connects to a larger movement inside of Canada and worldwide.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. We obviously can't answer it completely in how much effect the No Canada on United Nations Security Council campaign had. A small group of activists began this campaign. Actually, we began it months ago, and then the pandemic put a 2-month pause into it. But we began it by launching a open letter signed by many prominent people, published in the Toronto Star, the widest circulated paper in the country. And then it got a decent amount of attention that day, and the Prime Minister was forced to respond to it in a press conference. And then there was a series of different elements to this campaign that included sending 1,300. There was another open letter focused specifically on Palestine. One that was just general about critical of Canadian foreign policy. One focused on Palestine. And then there were 1,300 individuals that emailed every single UN ambassador critical of Canada's policy on Palestine. Then another one that focused more generally, then one focused on the Caribbean countries and emailed Caribbean ambassadors critical of Canadian policy in the Caribbean. Another one focused on African ambassadors critical of Canadian policy in Africa. What we do know, we can't say for sure how much impact this had. We know it generated a fair bit of media attention within this country and globally. But what we can say for sure is that the Canadian ambassador to the UN, Marc-André Blanchard, was so concerned about our campaign that he actually penned a letter that he delivered to every single UN ambassador trying to push back about our criticisms of Canadian policy with regards to Palestine. And so if he felt the need to do that, that was because he heard from many different ambassadors in New York that there was a lot of talk about what we were saying. And of course, what we were saying was, completely well documented. And in their letter responding to us, claimed that we were erroneous, but never pointed out any of our errors, of course. So what we know is that Canada lost by 20 votes to Ireland. But the way it works is that you need to have 2/3 of the General Assembly to not have a second round. So Norway had 130 votes, Ireland had 128, and Canada had 108. If Ireland would have had 127, there would have been a second round of voting where theoretically Canada could have gained some of the votes that Norway had had. So if we just impacted one country to not vote for Canada and instead vote for Ireland, that impacted the vote. And I'm totally confident that we did have that impact. And because the information we were putting forward was really irrefutable, and we contrasted Canadian policy, foreign policy to Irish foreign policy to Norwegian foreign policy, and in so many areas, Irish and Norwegian foreign policy were less bad. In some cases, were actually good. Now, what does this mean for Canadian foreign policy going forward? This was a shock to many Canadians. The loss of the Security Council bid was, front page news. It's a rare time when it was really clear that the world was rejecting Canada. As much as the government tried to spin that, it was pretty hard to avoid the obvious. We have now launched another campaign calling for a fundamental reassessment of Canadian foreign policy in light of the failed bid at the Security Council. And what's interesting is that in the 5 days of gathering signatures, we had many more prominent individuals sign on to this than the previous open letter opposed to Canada's bid for the Security Council. So what I take from that in part is that you have this sort of opening that people, within kind of progressive circles, but that are generally supportive of Canadian foreign policy, are sort of saying, hey, this is real. There is a real problem with Canadian foreign policy. The world has rejected Canadian foreign policy quite clearly at the UN, and we need to sort of look at this in a more fundamental way. So this seems to be an opportunity to break through the very narrow spectrum of debate on Canadian foreign policy. And I'm hoping that there will be some lasting impact to both the Security Council vote and the campaigning that's been done around it.
Well, it's been fascinating. It really has. I mean, I think what you described in our conversation today really shows the power of what a movement can do, and also how the world can hear a message and how things build and change. So, thank you for the work that all of you do in this regard. And Eve, thank you always for being ready to talk with us here at the Real News. We look forward to many more conversations.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
It's been my pleasure. And I'm Mark Steiner here with the Real News Network. I want to thank you all for watching. Let us know what you think. And please take care.